early investment. The neat thing about what we're going to look at today is this is one of the few instances that is covered in all four of the gospel accounts. We have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Matthew, we find out that just beforehand, John the Baptist has been beheaded. In Mark, we find out there's more to it than just that. That it's a stress out point for those that were disciples of John. Some of the apostles were formerly disciples of John. In Luke, we find out the numbers part. When it says that there's 5,000, you wonder how in the world they know it was 5,000. Well, they knew the 5,000 men because the men were sitting down in groups of 50. And in the Jewish culture at that time, men and women and children weren't all mixed together. In a public setting, the men would be by themselves, the women and children would be separate and apart from that. So when it says 5,000 men, that one's an easy one to figure out. Groups of 50, that's approximately 100 groups that you're going to see almost. And then there's the additional, all the groups of women and children, and some people guess that this was probably closer to 23,000 people that were gathered at this time. And then you've got John. In John's account, we hear about Andrew and the lad. John chapter 6, beginning with verse 2, it says, "Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased." And then jumping down to verse 14, "Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, 'This is truly the prophet who has come into the world.'" They weren't there to hear what he had to say necessarily. They were there because of what they had seen and heard about before, and whoa, we just got to see it again. A lot of people that were coming weren't coming because of who Jesus was. They were coming because of the show. But there's a bit of truth mixed in with this as well, beyond the part that they're missing. They've got a little bit of rightness mixed in. And that's the aspect of the prophets. In John 1:21, jumping back to many sermons ago, they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" At this point, they're talking to John the Baptist. He said, "I'm not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." And when it says the prophet there, it's most likely referring back to Deuteronomy 18:15, where it said, "The Lord our God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst. From your brethren you shall hear him." The prophet they were looking for, if it wasn't Elijah, was Moses. And the reason why at the end of John, when we read it there in chapter 6, that they said, he is the prophet, let's make him king, is because he had fed the thousands. What was Moses known for? Manna from heaven. And then the quail. Elijah also fed, but in case of Elijah, it was just two people. It was the widow and her son. So when they're looking for the prophet, they're looking for a man like Moses. And what did Moses do? Let him out of Egypt. What do they want to be doing? Getting out from under Rome's thumb. They're looking for a king who can take up the sword and change things their way. But then, this isn't about their way, is it? God is the one who foretold, "I'm going to send you a prophet like Moses." What was Moses? The lawgiver. In John, we've already discussed Moses a couple of times. There are comparisons right in John in the very beginning between Moses and Christ. Moses brought the law. Christ brought mercy. It's significant that God foretells about the prophet coming. But for these people, it wasn't because they were going to get it the first time through. Fact is, it was more along the lines of, okay, here's the bookmark. Because when you realize you've missed it and go back, you're going to be able to tell what it was you were missing. Because you're going to start to recognize, oh wait, if the prophets come, shouldn't we have been doing something differently? What was God's real point in sending the prophet? Was it to send the man who was going to lead them out from under Rome's thumb? Well, we've got history and we know that's not the case. Well, was it to make the Roman rule less violent and less authoritative over them? No, it gets worse. What was God's point in letting them know, I'm sending the prophet? So that he tells it with Moses and reaffirms it with Malachi. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 10, it says, so he sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. Continuing, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. So from Matthew's account, the prophet, first off, is dealing with the death of his cousin. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. Jesus is dealing with that because, as we've already discussed, Jesus is 100% human as well as being fully God. On the human level, I don't think there's anybody here that's going to be comfortable with the idea of a cousin being beheaded. We're not just going to get up, oh well, and move along with life. That's something serious. That's something that takes us down a notch. Excuse me. And yet, even when he's separating himself, they're coming to follow him. They're seeking what he can do for them. And right now, as we already said, they're not really getting it. But even in that time when he's stressing a bit, he still has compassion for them. Moses was a humble man, humble before God, humble before the Israelite nation. Jesus came that same way. As a humble man, who even when he himself is feeling the weight of the world a bit, still is looking out on that world with compassion. In Mark's account, Mark 6:30, then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all they had done. And we're going to get to what they had done in just a bit. And what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. I think that one's a pretty cool one because of what he's about to end up doing. So part of the reason that they are going off is because Jesus is having compassion on his own apostles. Because some of them, as I said, were John's disciples. And things are so hectic, they can't eat. They can't get a moment's peace. So Jesus wasn't going apart by himself only. He was bringing his apostles with him because they needed the same kind of relief, because they were suffering in many ways the same way, and because it's such a madhouse right now, right after the execution of John. But they told him all they had done. That's where we find Luke's part of it. Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them to preach the kingdom of God and heal the sick. This is what's happening just before the beheading of John. So just before the beheading of John is when Jesus sends out the apostles with the power and authority to cast out demons, to cure diseases. And then the hammer drops. John's beheaded. Everybody's coming back to the one they trust. It's like, whoa, this is just what's happened right now. Whole lot of stress. But they did go when we told the demons to leave. They did get cured when we cured them. They're trying to process a whole lot at this one critical moment in time. It's sort of like a gut check. They were sent out with power and authority, and then boom, shot to the gut. John's beheaded. John, who was the messenger who went before Christ. Things aren't so cool any longer because they're using a sword and they're using it in a mean way. All we're doing is healing. Their healing didn't take the fangs out of Rome. It was still a nasty, violent world. So, all of this is sort of the background setting that's there when Jesus feeds 5,000 men plus the women and children that are present. That's a whole lot to be going on in life. That's a whole lot of stress. So we got to realize what's really taking place when thousands are being fed. John 6, verse 5 and following. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to him, for he himself knew what he would do. Continuing, verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many?" Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He's talking to the men he had sent out with power and authority to cast out demons. Power and authority to heal diseases. How are we going to feed these people? What are you talking about? You understand how expensive that would be? We could spend 8 months, 200 denarii. And if we spent 200 denarii, 8 months worth of work and pay and so forth, not everybody's even going to get a bite to eat. Feeding the thousands wasn't about the thousands. Who wasn't getting it yet? Those who were right there with him, who were given the power to heal, given the power to cast out demons. The cool thing is Andrew. Because Andrew isn't the one saying, "Oh, I found some gold. Here's some money over here." What did Jesus say to do? You feed them. What does Andrew do? Brings back one with food. Okay, supposed to feed him. What do we got? He goes out, finds a little guy who's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Okay, Lord, this is what I found. Because Andrew expects something's going to happen and he's got no idea what. That's having faith even when you don't know what's going to come next. He found and brought the lad who had the loaves and the fishes. And as far as why are they being tested? Because they didn't recognize what their part really was yet. We got power to heal. Is that their purpose? No, it's not. Because we already have been discussing what was Jesus' purpose in being there. To seek and save that which was lost. The apostles really aren't getting that yet. And time-wise, this is at least the second Passover, if not the third. They're not sure totally on number of Passovers that occurred. They're not sure exactly, is it almost 3 years or is it almost 4 years? But they've been with Jesus for a time and still aren't getting it all the way. Jesus is trying to grow the apostles' faith. He wasn't trying to say, oh, here, I can do the Moses thing. I can feed thousands. Because it wasn't about physically feeding the thousands. It was growing them so they could become the spiritual leaders they needed to be when Jesus wasn't going to be there any longer. Potentially feeding 23,000, you know what? The number doesn't matter. The fact that he was the one doing something similar to Moses, in some respects, that part didn't matter. The impact he was going to have on people because of who he was, that's the part that mattered. Imagine if you were that little boy. One of the apostles came and got me today. Why? Well, they needed food. Why did they get you? Well, I had my loaves and I had my fishes. What good was that? That's not enough for 5 people. Because you got, I gotta get it wrong. I was gonna get enough for 7 people. You got 5 loaves, you got 2 fishes. That's not enough to feed the apostles. Oh yeah, it fed 23,000. How do you think that little boy felt at the end of the day? Knowing that his loaves and fishes fed thousands. I think his faith in what Jesus was capable of doing grew a whole lot. When we think of early investment, unfortunately, we tend to think of money only. We don't think about it oftentimes in a spiritual way. Because a year with Jesus wasn't enough for the apostles. Even if it's 2 years, it still wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed to grow more. If men with Jesus needed more than a year to 2 years, how much investment do we need to be making in our own spiritual growth and in the spiritual growth of those around us? Having power and authority over demons and diseases wasn't enough. Think about Judas. He was one of the ones who had that power. It took more than time with Jesus. It took more than being granted the power over demons and over diseases. The other part of it is we're not promised a later. In this particular case, the later, we're talking a year, maybe 2 years' time. And then Jesus is gone. He's building with everything he can, knowing he's working on a limited time scale. We're working on a similar kind of limited time scale, but we don't know when that deadline runs. Because an investment is something that we want to grow. Jesus was investing in his apostles because he wanted their faith to be growing. We want to be investing in ourselves and investing in those little ones. Because we want that faith to be something that's growing. And unfortunately, okay, I jumped ahead. This isn't the unfortunate one. This is the good one. On the good side, it's not just about investing in myself. Because who was Jesus investing at this time? He was investing in the apostles. He was investing in all those he was giving witness to who were coming for the wrong reason. Because one day that investment was going to pay off. And also because it's all under attack. The investment doesn't sit by idly. We know that in the case of Jesus, those apostles are under attack constantly. Peter's going to be the one that's going to become a Judaizing teacher. He's going to start missing the point. We build and build and build on that investment so that we can withstand the storms we're going to face in this life. Wrapping it up. What profit is a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what would a man give in exchange for his soul? This is talking in terms we do understand. Profit and giving. How great an investment are we talking about? We're talking about an eternal one. How serious an investment is it? When you talk about my kids, you're talking about serious as life and death itself. Jesus came not because they were always going to get it, but to lay the foundation so that when they did get it, they could come back and look and see, wow, he fed thousands, showing himself to be the prophet. He did good even when they didn't get it. Why? Because just because we're not being recognized for the good that we're doing doesn't mean we stop doing good. Why? And I could go on and on and on. And that's why we've got a book that gives us more and more about the good of what Jesus does. We're called to invest ourselves and invest in others, not because we get it fully now. I don't know how many people would have ever thought I'd be up in a pulpit, but because you don't know what's going to come later on. And maybe that kid that you encourage is going to be the kid who's in a pulpit or out in a mission field. We invest because it's the example Christ gave us. We invest because just like us, there are going to be times when you're going to run up against somebody that takes off the head of John the Baptist and you're going, and you've got to do what's right then. We invest because it's the example Christ gave us. If you need to take him on in baptism, or you need the prayers of the church, you're more than welcome to come as we stand and sing.